Police have read it. Who was the worst criminal you've ever had to detain? What did they do? How did you feel once they'd been arrested? My worst was a reopens to a home for attempted suicide with the individual still armed with a knife. When we arrived, the suspect was walking down the side of the road at 3 a.m. covered in blood from having cut himself over most of his body with moderate to deep cuts. He was covered. While we were standing around ordering him to drop the knife, he stood like a statue, not saying anything but staring. This guy was a towering 6'5", 220 pound man who looked at me, a 160 pound 22-year-old, and said, "I'm going to take your gun and shoot him," referring to my FTO at the time, who was similarly built to me. I deployed a taser which did nothing but anger him. My FTO deployed his, which brought him down. Trying to handcuff a man covered in blood is terrifying. All the bloodborne diseases you can contract. He was transported to the hospital for his self-inflicted wounds. Upon further investigation, this guy had been luring cats and dogs to him, which he would end up killing and skinning. In this guy's shed he had a harvesting room, where he would turn the pelts of these animals into clothing. You name it, this guy had made it. The entire thing reminded me of some horror movie with a stench you could not stomach. That was my first week as a sworn officer. I turned 21 3 days before graduating the academy. I've been on now for a year or so, and that is the only guy I have ever met I believe could have taken my weapon and kill me. He later was declared mentally competent and charged. He as well was not suicidal but angry because he messed up on one of his creations. I've been in the police for nearly 2 years now. I was working a late shift on Christmas Eve, which is usually a matter of holding the fort and counting down the clock until the end of shift. We get a call. Sudden death. An elderly gentleman. A shame certainly, but nothing more than assumed routine. Inspecting the body for signs of trauma and calling the undertakers to remove the deceased. We get there and go in. The gentleman is lying on his sofa with a duvet covering him. I perform the usual inspection of the house, looking for anything out of place or suspicious. Not that it'd be easy. The house was like your over-the-top hoarder's palace. After some inquiries, it became apparent that the gentleman had lost the use of his legs many years before and lived downstairs, relying on his daughter to care for him utterly. We have to inspect the body for any signs of trauma or suspicious marks prior to calling the undertaker, so that we are sure that there is nothing untoward in relation to the death. We lifted off the duvet, as only his head was showing, and I was rather taken aback and stunned. The main images, having studied history at university, that came to mind was the pictures from the liberation of the concentration camps, emaciated and starved corpses. This man had been dead for no more than 4 to 5 hours, yet he was all skin and bones. He relied on his daughter to care for him, and he clearly had not been. He lay there in his own filth, wasting away without anyone properly looking after him. It was utterly despicable. Death has a very distinct smell. It clings to your uniform and your body. I finished my shift in the early hours of the morning, went home and tried to sleep. I couldn't. I just lay there, eyes wide open, the man's body and his haunting stare taking centerpiece in my thoughts. In the end, I thought, F it, I'm not going to sleep at this rate. I got in my car and drove the 100 miles to my parents to spend Christmas Day with them. To end on a slightly more humorous note, whilst opening one of the doors in the house, a cat jumped out of the darkness at me, and I absolutely myself nearly tumbled down the stairs with a shrill yelp. Sorry for the long post. The one that stands out the most was my first domestic violence arrest. This guy was the absolute worst of the worst. Verbal and physical abuse, stealing the money for his pregnant wife and firstborn to eat, and blowing it all on booze and pokies, and culminating in him using industrial glue to seal his 4-month pregnant partner's lips shut, requiring her to be hospitalized in the hopes it would cause the fetus to terminate. Family violence section had been hunting this dirtbag for months, but he was a slippery customer. Anyway, one night we get a call from a local pub saying a guy had gotten maggoted and gotten into a car. They got the number plate and I recognized it as being this little scrote. It helped that ironically his number player was rectal code for drink driving, and his direction of travel was listed as being towards where I knew the girl lived. My partner and I set some kind of land speed record getting there, but found no trace of his car in the surrounding area. We knew he was nearby though. Sometimes you just feel these things. So we woke the still pregnant, girl up and explained to her we believed she was in imminent danger and that we would stay in the area. Gave her the response mobile phone number to ring and a phrase to say rather than call dispatch, which can cause a delay in sending out the job. Then we left. We both got in the car and drove around the corner. I dropped my partner off and he doubled back to keep an eye on the front of the house while I parked up around the corner, and our sergeant arrived in an unmarked car to view the street behind the house. Sure enough, within 10 minutes of us leaving, we suspect he had been hiding out waiting for us to leave. Old mate saunters up the driveway and makes a beeline for the door, where he is confronted by my partner. Realizing he has been tricked, he punches my partner square in the jaw. Now for the record, my partner at the time was an absolute beast of a man who was more offended by the fact somebody had laid hands on him than he was injured. Let's just say the next few minutes went poorly for our young Casanova as me and the Sarge came herring around the corner to assist with the arrest. Sadly we never got a conviction on the scrote, but we were able to get assistance from family violence to help the victim pack up and move interstate away from the situation. It still annoys me that he would go on to offend against other women, but at least we managed to help that one woman. She did make contact with our family violence section sometime later, and they tell me she is doing well. Sometimes in this job you have to take your victories where you can get them. Several years ago, I was called to a rural residence in my jurisdiction for a heated disturbance involving firearms. I work a rural county that covers almost 1,000 square miles with 3 other deputies. 4 deputies are on duty at any given time covering this area. To ease in keeping up with the story, the violator will be called grandfather in his upper 60s. The son of grandfather / 911 caller will be called son in his 30s. And the victim / granddaughter will be called child 7 years old. When I arrived on scene, I saw the son standing with a handgun in his hand and the handgun stuck in the mouth of the grandfather, who was on his knees. This took place in the front yard of this residence. My camera / audio was rolling due to me running lights / siren to this call, so all this is recorded and played a significant role in the prosecution. I slid to a stop and exited my car expeditiously while taking cover behind the driver's side wheel. Well, I had my Glock 34 out quickly and began giving commands to the son. He was in tears and screaming. The grandfather was motionless on his knees with a gun in his mouth and hands up. The son was screaming at me that he, grandfather, had actually assaulting the son's daughter. I told him repeatedly that I was here to help and all that good stuff. He took the gun out of the grandfather's mouth and threw it behind him in the grass and stuck his hands up. I moved forward and placed him into handcuffs as well as the grandfather due to me now knowing anything else about this situation. I then recovered the firearm and placed it in my vehicle. I confirmed the only other person at the residence was the child, who was inside at the window and watched all this unfold. My help was on the way, but still about 20 minutes away. I brought the son in front of my car to be recorded and asked his what was going on. He explained that he, his daughter and his father, grandfather to the child, all lived at the grandfather's house due to him losing a job recently. The son had a tough time after coming home from Iraq and holding a job. The son explained to me that he asked the grandfather for permission to use his laptop. He received permission and began looking stuff up on the computer. The son found a suspicious looking folder on the desktop and opened it. This folder had hundreds of pictures of the child, his daughter, in extremely explicit positions as well as performing sexual acts on the grandfather. Needless to say, he flew into a new dimension of pissed off and immediately retrieved his handgun and dragged his own grandfather to the child out in the front yard to avoid bloodying up the house. In his own words, he pistol whipped him and placed him on the ground and stuck his pistol in the grandfather's mouth. He never did explain to me why he called 911 instead of shooting the grandfather. I placed him back into my vehicle and told him to remain quiet because I needed to get information from the grandfather to get a conviction. I guess I should have mentioned I spent several years as a criminal investigator prior to going back to the patrol division, so I knew exactly what to look for and obtain during the investigation in order to obtain a conviction if a crime did in fact occur. I then brought the grandfather in front of my car and got out a written Miranda form from my car. I read and explained to the grandfather his rights, to which he signed in writing. Acknowledging he understood them, the grandfather then waived his rights in writing and spoke to me without an attorney. I tried to play to his emotion and asked him what was happening. He hung his head and told me he did something bad. I tried to belittle it and say stuff like at least no one is dead, we can all work through this, etc. He proceeded to tell me that he had been molesting his granddaughter, the child, for several months and had pretty much done everything but have intercourse with her. I asked him if he photographed any of this activity and he acknowledged he did. I asked him where it was and he told me that he had it on the desktop. A few jump drives and some new photos should still be on the digital camera. Thinking about his Fourth Amendment rights, I got a consent to search form out and requested he sign it to allow me to collect these items. He signed it. Dumbus. I would have gotten it anyway with a search warrant due to an overwhelming amount of facts present so far. I collected these items and did my best to comfort this precious little girl. I had my backup transport the grandfather to the jail and I took the son and child to the office to interview him. Long story short, the grandfather first pleaded not guilty and a trial date was set. The morning of trial, he took a plea for 80 years to serve for what he did. As far as how that made me feel, I will never understand how that son didn't turn his own father's head into a canoe. I cannot fathom the rage and anger he must have felt. I kept in contact with the son after the arrest, and through the prosecution phases, he eventually told me he didn't shoot him because he didn't want his daughter to lose her grandfather and father in one day. He thought he would go to jail for killing him. I have dealt with more savage people and been in a few rough spots before, but the cold-heartedness demonstrated by this bag of douche towards his own granddaughter blew my mind.
Consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video and if you want to see more of Reddit Universe.